Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Ed Wood Summit. This is number 3 of the Ed Wood Summit. We've started this off this year back in January, and in that initial summit, Joe Blevins was gracious enough to join us, and he's back again today. And in fact, I'm Greg Javer, so both of us write articles at his Dead to Rights blog for Ed Wood Wednesdays, and we were rather impassioned about our interest in Ed Wood. And Joe actually proposed to me uh, a topic for today's summit back late last year, and do a book review. So I subsequently suggested not one but 2 books, and we're going to do the first of those 2 books today, because they are in fact a pair of books. So I'm going to mention those in just a moment. But I do want to acknowledge, Joe, that this is not the first time you proposed to me that we would work a kind of dual review mode. Late in 2019, Joe had proposed the same to me, and we had sort of agreed upon doing about a half dozen articles where we would each do a review of a Ed Wood book, and unfortunately I failed to follow through on that, and it never came to fruition. So I'm glad that we're finally here, and we're finally really doing it, albeit not an article, but actually talking it through. So I wanted to give you a chance to. Did you want to say anything in opening? Any intro of any kind?
No, this is like the Oprah Winfrey Book Club, except if she chose Ed Wood novels. I think that's what I was going for, was sort of the Oprah Book Club, but for Ed Wood.
Okay, cool. So and the books, well, the book we're going to talk about, the pair of books are Watts the Difference and Watts After. So and Watts ... Watts ... the Difference, Watts ... Watts After. So they're both have that ellipses in the title. Of course, they're referencing the Watts Uprising, the Watts riots from August of 1965, which kind of swept across LA. I did a little background reading about it, and I guess the protests and the uprising spread across 46 full square miles of Los Angeles, which is yeah, quite astonishing.
How much time actually elapsed between the Watts Uprisings and the publication of the first book, do you think?
I don't think, well, the books are copyrighted in 1967, both of them. So presumably they would have had to have been written probably not long before they were published. There wasn't exactly a big editorial function at the adult paperback book writers. They probably turned it over fairly quickly. I would say he could have written it not too long after the event itself happened. If it happened in late summer of 1965, probably wrote them in 1966 sometime.
And I was wondering, what was the market for this? Who wanted an erotic? Who wanted the erotic novel inspired by the Watts riots? Like, who wanted like the Rule 34 version of the Watts riots? Someone must have, thought that was a good topic for an erotic novel, because that's what these are.
Right. Well, that's what they should. That's what they were intended to be, right? I'm not. I think it's questionable, perhaps, how much eroticism actually exists.
And then Ed being Ed, of course, he gets into all kinds of things, and we'll talk about maybe the character of Rance Holiday. And I had to wonder if somebody either reading an erotic novel or reading a novel about the Watts riots would even want all this material about this character of Rance Holiday. Like, they must be thinking, what the heck is this? And it reminded me of the thing in the Ed Wood, in the biopic of the Tim Burton biopic, where Georgie Weiss wants, he wants the Christine Jorgensen story, and the rest of it is about this schmuck in an Angora sweater, as they say in the movie. And Ed says, I don't think he's a schmuck. Well, that's kind of what this novel is. The Watts riots are his way into this topic, but then he just talks about, all of Ed's usual fascinations and fetishes. And oh my gosh, there's so much booze, there's so much whiskey and Angora all through this. So that's what I wondered. Like, who was the market for this?
Right. I can only imagine it wouldn't have exactly flown off the shelves, right? At the adult bookstore, the title that jumped out at you would not be Watts the Difference. And if you've seen the cover, the picture on the cover really is not what you would expect from to sell an adult novel, and it gives an image that looks like urban decay and violence. That being said, it obliquely references Watts only at the tail end of book one. The subject
Right.
almost doesn't even really come up throughout the book. So yeah, it's puzzling as to why he may have chose that. Now Joe, of course, that on one of Ed's resumes he mentioned having worked for Mayor Sam Yorty, who was the mayor of Los
Right.
Angeles at the time the riots happened, and in fact, it was kind of a cloud that hung over Mayor Sam subsequently through the remainder of his career. The
Yeah.
how awful it was, and Ed presumably worked with Sam perhaps in the capacity of something like a campaign speechwriter or something of that sort.
Right.
I think he possibly could have worked. Sam also had a TV talk show, and he could have worked with him in that regard because believe it was Buddy Hyde who also worked on the Criswell TV show, who worked on
Yeah.
one of Sam Yorty's TV shows, and he was an associate of Ed. So how Ed ultimately was involved with Sam Yorty, I don't know. I wonder, though, of course, could he have been, working for Sam as some kind of a speechwriter or something of that sort around the time of Watts when it happened? I don't know.
And this novel presents its own very crazy alternate theory of what might have started the Watts uprisings and where that actually came from. And there were studies of what really in real life led to the Watts riots.
Right.
And basically it was that these frustrations had been long simmering with the
Yeah.
residents of Watts, and it just took the spark that just set this off. Like this was going to happen. This dissatisfaction with Yorty and with the police and with the schools and with the employment situation in Watts, and
Right.
anything could have set it off. And what eventually did set it off was a traffic stop. It
Uh-huh.
was, but Eddie, maybe, Eddie has his own very odd conspiracy theories about what led to this. And it gets increasingly absurd toward the end of the book. Eddie always has, I guess Eddie today might be like a QAnon kind of guy. I don't know. Eddie has a lot of conspiracy theories. And then that's that's where the book is eventually heading. But, I would say that he does touch on some of the issues that really did lead to the Watts riots, because our main character, who's a black actor named Rocky Alley, did grow up, I believe, in Watts. And he returns, basically, the book kind of goes full circle because he returns during the riots. He has to go back into the neighborhood where he grew up. And you see there's scenes that take place during his childhood where he's living in just god awful, wretched poverty. And Edward really knows squalor, and he can
Yeah.
really write squalor. And the scenes at the very beginning of the book, I think, are some of the most powerful things in the book, because you see the wretched conditions under which Rocky was living as a child, and a truly disgusting scene that happens when Rocky and his friend are coming down off the roof of their building. And I guess Ed Wood never put it together. Hey, that squalor in which he was living, in which, they're living in just very unsanitary, unsafe conditions at the beginning of the book. Maybe that's what leads to the riot at the end of the book. Maybe that there's some connection there, but Ed doesn't make that connection. Ed thinks that there was obviously, again, some sort of strange conspiracy that was leading to the.
Right. Right. We'll get into that as we get deeper into the actual narrative of the first
So
book.
now this book came from Pad Library, is that
Right.
correct?
Pad Library, publisher out of Agora, California, and they were fairly prolific in the largely mid 60s for a brief stint of time. Ed wrote quite a few books that came out under the Pad imprint many others. If you looked through his filmography, there are quite a few others. I've read a few other pad titles myself, and I actually believe, and I'm not going to get into that here, but I believe there's a pad library book written by Ed under a pseudonym that has thus far been undisclosed. So
All right.
more to come on that some other day, right?
Now, in Ed Wood Summit #2, were there any pad library books in there?
There was, I believe, only one out of that grouping of books. Yeah, but I have a few others as well.
Cool.
So, but yeah, Pad was just one of many. I mean, there were dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of publishers in what was a really burgeoning market in the 1960s.
Yeah. Back then, you could sell those. You could sell those dime. Well, how much did those novels cost a piece back then? Not a dime.
75 cents, a dollar, 95 cents, something like that. I mean,
Yeah.
50 cents in 1962, 63, you'll see 50 cents on some of the covers, and by 63 or so, they go up to 75. Probably, I don't know off the top of my head, 95 cents is probably what you would have paid for one of the Watts books.
Well, I guess you get your money's worth.
Right.
In a weird way, you do get your money's worth out of those. You get your 95 cents worth. I would have paid 95 cents for it.
Sure. Sure. I think, well, interestingly enough, I don't think you have physical copies of the books, nor do
Oh, no.
I. Right. So we are reviewing these. I nonetheless, I can only speak for myself from an electronic copy. When the books obviously published in 1967, they were never republished as far as I know. At least in that market. They subsequently did come out on the market in 2006 through Ramble House, the publisher Ramble House, their Woodpile series, which ultimately was legally challenged, and those books are now no longer available in the marketplace. So you'd actually have a pretty hard time finding a copy of Watts the Difference or Watts After right now. I see them go up on auction very, very rarely, and if you did see one, you'd probably pay a lot more than 95 cents. That's for sure.
Right, and there was an edition of the first book. Was it not re-released under the title "Burn Baby Burn"?
The second one, right? Watts
Second
After.
one came out.
I believe
Watts After was Burn Baby Burn.
with the pseudonym Ray Jones, I believe was the pseudonym who Burn Baby Burn is attributed to. Yeah, put out by a different publisher in 1969. So yeah, it was repurposed or swiped and or said sold it to a different publisher under a different title. Who knows, right?
Yeah. So, do you want to give maybe an overview of what the book is about or who's in it?
Yeah, you kind of already touched a little bit on it. So our main character is Rocky, and we learn his last name, Ali, very late in book one, actually. He's just Rocky throughout. And I mentioned that in the last summit that very typical of Ed to only use first names for his characters, which he does pretty consistently here. But he drops a couple of the characters' last names really only like one time throughout the whole entire book.
Well, I think that the one exception that goes through all of Eddie's writing is if the first character's name is Rance.
Yeah.
Rances always get last names, and we have a Rance here. For some reason, Eddie was in love with writing that name Rance. He loved people named Rance.
He had an uncle named Rance on his dad's side, on his father's side. Yeah.
He must have loved that name because he likes, and the Rances always get last names. So there's a bunch of short stories where Rances have last names, and we have a Rance here.
Right. We have Rance Holiday. And other short stories, there's like Rance Wilkinson and Rance this, Rance that. But yeah, so Rance Holiday is one of the characters here. So Rocky, nonetheless, is a young black man growing up in Watts, and he has a friend named Sammy when the book starts. And Sammy is of Mexican descent, and Sammy subsequently has he dies rather suddenly, right?
Yeah, and in a kind of a gross kind of way. Like there's like it's not only unpleasant, but it's also Ed tries to make it as unpleasant and unappetizing as possible, the scenes surrounding Sammy's death. But at least, I mean, it's an interracial friendship in an Ed Wood novel.
Right.
So
right. And that's how the book opens, and it really is just to establish, I think, Rocky's character, because there's really, although he thinks back to his friendship with Sammy quite frequently throughout the book, it's almost, there's a
Yeah.
stream of consciousness feel to the book where very suddenly it just will jump in time to something in the past, something that is nebulous in terms of when it may have even happened.
Yeah, I think that's maybe the most distinctive feature of this book is that it's all stream of consciousness. Basically, I would say that the book takes place, really, the action of the book takes place during a single weekend, basically, that Rocky is spending with his girlfriend. And both Rocky and his girlfriend are just flashing back to the past. And they're sometimes awake and sometimes asleep. And they're sort of drifting in and out of consciousness when they're not having sex or swimming.
Mm-hmm.
And just because you're in one flashback doesn't mean you can't flash back to something else within a flashback. So this is part of the reason why I sometimes prefer Ed's short stories to his novels, because Ed can really lose the thread sometimes, because it just gets like a flashback within a flashback or a dream within a dream. And you're wondering, like, where
Completely.
are we in time? And it was very, very difficult sometimes to get my bearings throughout this first book, because,
Right.
there'll be a scene where the current day Rocky is in his swimming pool in the Hollywood Hills, I'm guessing is where he's supposed to be. And then it will be Rocky as a 16-year-old drowning or almost drowning in a public pool
Mm-hmm.
back in Watts. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess we're here now. And then we haven't even gotten to the other character, the other major character of the book, Angie. Angie has like a whole saga.
Right.
And what it also reminded me of was, I had to do some of the book reviews myself last year, basically, and I reviewed the Only House, which was the full-length novel of the same plot as Necromania. And it's written in a lot the same way. The characters are, going through the story and they're having sex and all this, but they're also flashing back to their past. So Danny and Shirley and Tanya all are getting flashbacks to
Right.
their past. And I just wonder if maybe that was the way Ed's mind was working at that time.
It kind of makes you wonder, could it have been the alcohol, right? Was
Well,
he
yeah,
hammered? Was he hammered to the extent that he loses
well,
sight of the narrative more or less entirely,
and then the characters in this book are drinking
constantly?
almost constantly.
Right.
And Imperial whiskey is mentioned by name,
Yep.
but I would say that the number one alcohol through this is gin.
Gin. Right.
And the politics of when to drink gin and when not to drink gin is kind of an issue in the Watts books, because Rocky will drink gin, but he doesn't like it. He doesn't like to be seen drinking gin because he thinks that that's a low class thing. That's like something that poor black people drink. So he doesn't want to be a gin drinker. He
Right.
aspires to be a whiskey drinker or something.
Right.
But I
And
like that even the rich Rocky is drinking Imperial,
right,
which
which
I
is
was,
rot gut, right? It's cheap,
yeah,
cheap
it's
whiskey.
paint
Yeah.
thinner, basically.
Right. So, um, so yeah, the stream of consciousness feel. Uh, I agree with you. His short stories, Ed can maintain himself for the space of 6 or 8
Yeah,
pages, and then typically maybe he can tack a sting in the tail at the end of a short story, and it seems to have a beginning and an ending. This is just
yeah,
this sort of just it almost just meanders. You mentioned there's he and Angie are constantly having sex throughout, although it is a sex book purportedly. They don't really ever get into it graphically.
no,
The sex scenes are almost elided. It's almost as if we
yeah,
just sort of skip through them very, very quickly, and then we move on into essentially another one of the characters' reveries, whichever character it may be at the time. But
yeah.
they're
It's very
constantly in these
dreamy.
they're constantly in these kind of reveries, and in fact, it starts out that way with Rocky and Sammy as teenage boys, kind of hanging out together, and they're looking up, staring at the sun. And we get that scene a couple of times early on in the book where Rocky's doing that, and later on we get that notion, I believe, Angie's character looking up at the moon, and so
Yeah,
there is that sort of, it does lend that sort of dreamlike feel to it. It's easy to get lost entirely in the narrative, and you have to sort of catch yourself and go, wait a minute, where are we in this particular point in time?
yeah. I wondered if Ed himself was flashing back to his own past, if he was like one of these people who was constantly ruminating about his childhood and early experiences of his, maybe, you know, when he is lost in his own thoughts, when he's, you know, sitting drunk in his apartment, if he's thinking back to his
Right.
childhood and stuff.
Right.
So,
I think so, because again, it does
yeah,
happen in other books, as you mentioned, not only in the Only House, but it's not uncommon for Ed's characters to sort of drift, and in many cases, his characters will pick up pieces of his biography, will become, you know, parts of their
right,
experience. Let me I took a lot of notes when I went through it. I'm certainly
great,
not going to
great.
go through them in grave detail, but I wanted to just kind of jump through them really quickly to because so it's hard. We started talking about, you know, who the main characters were and give you guys a sense of what the book is like, but it's hard for us to even articulate anything that's approaching a narrative.
Right. I would say the real narrative is that an actor and his girlfriend spend a weekend together, and they both ruminate about their lives, and they both have traumatic events in their past that shape who they are today. And that's it. Basically, that's what happens.
Right,
Almost nothing happens in the novel. You could say that a bunch of events happen because both Rocky and his girlfriend Angie have all these traumatic events, or you could say virtually nothing happens in the book because it's just them dreaming or
right,
remembering. So either a ton of stuff happens in this book or nothing happens in this book, and that's kind of the way Ed Wood is.
right. Exactly. So, sorry, that's my dog barking. My dog is the you know, obviously
Literary
guard
critic.
guarding the house. Yeah, no, guarding the house. Yeah. Literary critic. I wonder what the dog may think of Watts the Difference. But yeah, so Angie and Rocky. It's not revealed actually until a little ways into the book that Rocky is in fact a TV actor. Early
Right.
on, we still don't really know much. He becomes early on, he becomes a driver and then sort of a bodyguard for a gentleman named Gimme at some point along the way in the book. And
Yeah.
Gimme, from the jump, Gimme is described as having, you know, a pinstripe suit and a wide-brimmed hat, and turns out he is indeed a pimp, which is.
Yeah.
Among other things, because it turns out as we learn more about Gimme that he's also a member of a rather shadowy organization. You know, and Ed likes capitalizing things sort of randomly every now and then.
Yes, he
So
does.
he does it here where he capitalizes words throughout, like gin or death, and he capitalizes certainly black power when he gets into when we get into that portion of the book where Gimme is revealing to Rocky that he works for the organization, sort of starting to take him under his wing a bit and into the organization. Gimme subsequently meets his end, um, rather like completely out of left field,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. It's a shocking scene. Gimme, I guess, is a subordinate to another underground leader, a guy named, we haven't talked about yet, but a guy named Preacher Moses,
Hmm.
uh, the leader of a group sometimes called the Mosites, and sometimes just called, I think it's just the organization.
The organization, yeah.
And Rocky is meeting with these guys in a bar. Of course, alcohol and bars are a huge motif throughout this entire duology of books. And well, there's a scene that if this were made into a movie, it would be expensive and difficult to film. It would be an exciting scene, I guess, but it's just kind of out of nowhere.
Yep. Um, so so Gimme, yeah, he Preacher Moses. We learn as we get deeper into it, somebody who uh, was at earlier on. We When we first meet Preacher Moses, he is of course giving lessons to Rocky's mom, right? He was
Yeah,
yeah, lessoning. We was lessoning, I think is what he
yeah.
says precisely. Um, Go
And
ahead.
I think that's you know, there's songs and stories about deacons down in the South, you know, supposedly deacons of the church who are actually great lovers of all the women in town, and they're getting money and food and favors from everybody around. And I think that's where this preacher Moses character comes in. I think it's kind of Ed's idea of what a black religious leader might be, and preacher Moses and his quote unquote lessoning. Obviously there's nothing really to it, but it really reminded me of a song by Louis Jordan and the Timpani Five called Deacon Jones. I think,
Okay.
who's the country's greatest lover? Deacon Jones. And so Deacon is preaching, Deacon Jones is preaching the word, but he's also inviting himself to every dinner and, has girlfriends all over town. And that's basically Preacher Moses. And what I guess surprised me about Preacher Moses was that I thought of him basically as more of a burlesque kind of character, a comic character, but he has more of a significance, I guess, to the underground movement, because he's, for a time being, he's sort of the boss of all bosses of
Right.
in the underground movement until until one of Eddie's famous twistaroos that he likes to have in his books.
Right. Where it's revealed, yeah, there is a boss above the boss. So, and the layers peel back one more layer. And of course, the organization ultimately wants to have everybody, in the end, speak Swahili, right? That's one of their
Yeah.
goals, one of their end goals. So,
And getting to it, just a preview of the second book, the Swahili thing eventually just becomes the name of one of the bad guys in in the second book is just called Swahili. So
right,
I don't know where all this, again, this is Eddie's conspiracy theories kind of running wild here. I think this is Eddie's booze-addled understanding of the Black Power movement and the civil rights movement. Eddie is kind of, Eddie was very, very suspicious of the civil rights movement. And he saw even integration as some kind of like international communist plot. That's something that comes up occasionally in his stories. So I think that even came up in Drag Trade. There's a part where there's a bar that's supposed to be integrated, and Eddie is very much against that bar being integrated. So
yeah. Actually, that reminds me, there's Tony Black Empress, one of Ed's sort of lesser known novels, but it's actually one of my favorite of his books entirely. Probably my very favorite Ed Wood book, and it's not. Its setting is not dissimilar. It's set in urban. A world of urban decay, and it's set in with an organization, a Black Power organization, which is corrupt in and of itself. Of course, institutions in Ed's work are generally corrupt, right?
right.
Or people, human nature. He has a fairly bleak view of human nature, quite honestly.
He does. So in a way, you have to cherish relationships like the ones that Rocky has with Angie.
Yeah.
Because they have found each other in this chaotic, fallen world. And again, Rocky and Sammy at the beginning of the book had a real genuine friendship, and that's tragic when Sammy meets his end, and then Rocky is denied even the comfort of going to Sammy's funeral, and
Mm-hmm.
that's an issue. And death, oh my gosh, if Ed
Right.
has, I've said that Ed's muses are death, sex, booze, and women's clothing,
Right.
and he thinks about all four of those things here. He works those into every single chapter of the book. He thinks a lot about death, and funerals and dying and coffins. That's a big thing on Eddie's mind a lot of the time. And all the characters are drunk. And we haven't even gotten into how much Angora there is in this book.
Right.
And oh boy,
Lots.
is there
Yeah.
lots.
It's mentioned in I would say virtually every chapter of the book at least once.
Yep.
And blue Angora quite often.
Blue Angora this
Blue
time.
Angora, yeah. Blue.
So he's had white Angora, pink Angora,
Well,
and
Angie, the character Angie, her name actually in the book is a diminutive for Angora because she likes to wear Angora. Because Angie, it turns out, as we flash back into her past, she's had a really profoundly disturbing events in her younger life in Alabama. She hails from
And
Alabama, and her name is Ruth Cooper. We find out.
yes, and Ruth's story has what I would call one of those classic Ed Wood twists. And I could completely imagine the story of Ruth Cooper being taken out of this novel and worked into like a 7 or 8 page short story, where it's leading to one of Ed's twists, you know, where you're led to think one thing, and then about like 75% of the way through a story, what you've been told was actually wrong, or what you thought was actually wrong. And happens with Ruth. Um, and it's an example of how, yeah, Eddie definitely had some messed up views about race, and certainly about the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. But he also saw how Black people would be unfairly persecuted for things. And that's a little bit what Ruth's story is about. And I thought it was interesting in the Alabama scenes how um, white people could be of low status and low value just because they're horrible people. Like that would make you an awful person. But a Black person would be of low status just for being Black.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the question that really haunts Rocky all through this novel, that he asks himself repeatedly, is why is Black bad? Why is this so bad that I'm Black? Like, it's not even a choice. I just am this thing. Why is that so bad? And then you have the story of, and then you just have the story of Rufus, the farmhand, and the strangely named Caraway.
Caraway from Alabama.
Caraway from Alabama. And you have this story of what happens between Caraway and Ruth and Rufus. And it's really a story of injustice that's carried out because of racial reasons. And that was another thing I just realized, was that a lot of Eddie's flashbacks, if female characters have flashbacks to their past, and this happens in a lot of his stories and a lot of his novels, if female characters are having flashbacks to their past, it's traumatic sexual experiences. It's always like they're flashing back to being sexually assaulted or raped, and that's just something that Eddie works into so many of his books. I'm not exactly sure why, but it certainly gives you some insight into who Angie is, when you realize that she has all these events in her past. The thing that also interested me about the Alabama stuff is that, again, Eddie has this notion of the South, the American South, that I think must come from movies or novels, or, maybe he's reading Tobacco Road or something. And he loves to write in dialect for them. And he loves to write that kind of stuff. And I don't think he has any clue what he's doing, but I think he has, he has this compunction to write about the American South and people who are sharecroppers and things like that. He puts that in so many of his stories and books. I was like, Eddie, you don't know this world. You should maybe lay off on this.
Well, that's interesting because right from the get-go, early on, we realized the dialogue early on, the conversations even between Sammy and Rocky. And Sammy and Rocky are boys who were born and raised in Southern California. And sure enough, their language has that sort of Southern aspect to it as well.
Yeah.
And it's constant. All the characters almost speak in that same sort of vernacular, and you wonder, did people in Southern California really sound like that in the mid 1960s?
Well, I'm starting to think back to Eddie's own films. At his very first film, Glen or Glenda, you have the hayseed saying, "Automobiles, bah, they scare the horses." Right. And I'm like, that's just the way Eddie liked to write. Eddie liked to write these Southern characters, I guess, out of Mark Twain or Erskine
Yeah.
Caldwell or whatever.
Well, I think potentially too, growing up across the river, the Hudson River, across the river from Poughkeepsie, there was Marbletown, which was where his family was largely his father's side of the family, anywhere where most of his aunts and uncles lived, and it was farmland, and some of his aunts and uncles even moved a little bit further north into the Catskills, and one of his uncles, I think Uncle Burton, had a dairy farm in the Catskills.
Hmm.
So these were probably pretty not the character in the hayseed character in Glen or Glenda to that extent, but there were probably people who were not dissimilar to that. So these were the
Right.
kind of people who Ed knew, and I believe his mother grew up on the side of the river north of Poughkeepsie, and I believe his mother and his father had very different sort of backgrounds. His father's background, living on the other side of the river, was very much growing up as a farmer.
So, yeah, he loves to write that kind of stuff, and I would have to imagine he would also take to popular culture that has that kind of material in it. I would have to think that he would love Lil Abner and
Yeah.
Snuffy Smith and stuff like that, and Ma and Pa, Ma and Pa Kettle movies.
Right.
I know now it makes sense that one of the stories in Nightmare of Ecstasy, of course, is that he submitted a script to the Beverly
Right.
Hillbillies, and so I think I think Ed loved that kind of material,
Sure.
and tried to write it into his novels whenever
And
possible.
he of course played in a hillbilly band when he was a
He
kid.
did.
The Sunshine Mountaineers.
Nears that I always picture it being like the Soggy Bottom Boys
Right.
from Oh,
Right.
oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
hmm And yeah, and it was I finally found a picture of them in their costumes where they're decked out, um, jug toting, straw hat wearing, the whole
And I think
shebang.
even like the Soggy Bottom Boys who wore
Yep.
the fake beards,
Yep.
I think he did that too. So it's just another flavor
Yep.
of this. An Ed Wood novel is like a cocktail where you pour in everything, in your kitchen. And so we haven't we have not yet spoken about the character really of Rance Holiday. Um, I don't know what Rance Holiday is doing in this book. Really, I don't know what he has anything to do with. I don't know that he has anything to do with the Watts material at all. I'm not sure that he belongs in this book, but Eddie writes him in, as well as one of his other favorite kind of standard characters, who is a very masculine butch lesbian character named Georgie. And Georgie and Rance seem very superfluous to this book, but they're in it, and they're in the sequel too. They even get more time in the sequel,
Right.
and
Rance
that's yeah.
Rance is introduced immediately as a quote unquote independent movie director. And
And I wonder,
then shortly thereafter, a couple sentences later, it says that he's a quote unquote drag queen.
and I had to wonder, is this Ed's self-insert character in the
That's
book,
how I took it
basically?
as well. Yeah.
And but what I had to wonder is, first off, if you're buying a sex novel, or if you're buying a Watts novel, for your 95 cents or whatever you spent, um, what did you think when you came to the parts about what is this? What is this Rance guy? This cross-dressing director, and what is this butch lesbian character? And the idea that the butch lesbian character is named Georgie, which is sort of an androgynous version of George, taking a masculine name and making it like an androgynous or feminine name. That's something that Ed, he just never got over that. He just loves to do that right from Glen or Glenda. And then there's that entire sequence at the beginning of the Violent Years, where all the girls have feminine names. They all write their names on the blackboard, and they're feminine versions of masculine names. I don't know why that fascinates Ed so much, but it does. Like, Ed never got over that. The idea that there could be masculine and feminine versions of names, even.
It is. all great stuff, all the points you're making, because what I hope people are getting a sense of as we're talking more about this is that it really is a cocktail of just Ed's thoughts and obsessions and whatever crossed his mind at that particular moment. Some books you can actually, I've had the sense anyway. Some books you can tell almost how much he's had to drink by how far the book starts to stray away from any sort of narrative coherence. And then so perhaps, at the start of a writing session, he's able to establish a few characters and establish a little bit of narrative momentum. And as he
Yeah.
continues to drink and become more and more inebriated, you get drawn almost into that
Yeah,
inebriate state when you're reading the books. So we really haven't done any spoiler alerts here for those who are going to try
not
to track this
really,
down
but
and go seek it out. But there's almost nothing to spoil.
yeah, really, it's just I would say if you can get a bottle of imperial whiskey, which is mentioned in the book. Oh, and speaking of things that he mentions in the book, I love that he works in a plug for Hollywood Rat Race, which had not
Yeah.
even come out yet. Um,
Right.
so Hollywood Rat Race gets a plug because we have yet another story. Basically, Angie is, another country girl who comes to Hollywood. And it's hard to say that she gets debauched by Hollywood because she was already pretty
Right.
thoroughly debauched by the time she gets there.
Yeah.
But
It's presented that she remains there because she wants to stay there. She actually is the Cotton Bowl queen, and she
Queen
wins a trip to Hollywood as
would,
the Cotton Bowl queen, and she decides
and
not to leave. Yeah.
contest winners, that is another big thing of girls winning contests and coming to Hollywood. And then she winds up as a topless waitress in Hollywood, and then I guess works her way up to acting is it because she meets Rance? Is that how she works her
Think,
way up
think.
into acting?
Right.
But she networks with movie producers and directors, I guess, in her job while she's topless. I don't know that ever happened one time in real life, but I know. I guess there was people like Hal Guthoo was handling the actresses who would work at the go-go bars and things, but he would also get them modeling jobs and acting jobs. But it doesn't seem like Angie is. I don't think she's working in porn or anything. She is at least aspiring to, and then does get into legitimate films and television. So I've never heard of somebody taking her particular career path, but I guess maybe in Ed Wood world,
Right.
you can start out as a topless. I, I don't think it ever has happened, but a topless waitress and then working your way up to movie star.
Right.
But
Hollywood Rat Race is actually presented as like a manual for how you're gonna
mhm.
navigate Hollywood. So Angie has read it, so presumably that has given her a map to how to figure
how
out
to
what she should
how
do
to
next.
negotiate Hollywood, including, what that's a book where Ed says, first off, his main message to the book is
Don't
stay
go.
home.
Right.
And his other message is sleep in the parks, like sleep at Griffith Park, which I don't think is a good idea. But that's what this novel is. It's this crazy stew of stuff. And we're going to, we're talking here about the first novel. I just want to briefly mention that the second novel, if what you're looking for is basically a narrative that starts at the beginning and then, intensifies, and they stick to it all the way through, book two is what you want, because Ed might have been a little bit more sober that day or that week when he wrote it. I don't know how long it took him to turn out these books. I don't think long. I think he would just get into
Oh yeah.
restate, and I think he doesn't do any rewriting. Um, that was the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. There was a lot of what I would call typos or misspellings all through this book, and I just wondered if that was just a matter of the editions that we were working from, or if Ed just didn't spell things correctly.
Those are even in if you look at originals of I haven't got a ton of
I've
them, but I've read a few Ed's originals, and there's typos galore. So
so yeah, so
I think the Ramble House editions actually wanted to preserve those.
well, no, I think it's
Yeah,
good that they do.
yeah.
That it gives you a sense of. I think it was worse in the first book, so I think Ed was pretty far gone when he was writing that, but it also just though it just gives you the sense that Ed was this guy whose head was all full of ideas, not coherent or good ideas all the time, but he was a guy who was just always thinking. And I think once he got a lot of drinks in him, I think he might be the first to say, this so-called civil rights movement, here's what it's all about. Going on, you see, is an international communist conspiracy. They're trying to control the youth, and and I guess the people around him just have to say, "Uh-huh, good. That's real interesting there, Ed." And he's one of those guys that just kind of goes on and on about it. Um, Kind of remind me when I was a kid, we used to go to this Little Caesars in Flint, Michigan, and uh, we eventually had to stop going there because the people it started attracting too many drunks because they sold beer there, and you just have people who would just get just rip roaring drunk and then would just start ranting and raving about stuff. And I think like Ed was somebody who could rant and rave, but maybe he just did it through his typewriter,
Hmm.
So, um, you know, was Ed Wood racist? I would say, yeah, he was. He grossly misunderstood the Black Power movement. I think he completely misunderstood what it was about. But I think there also is some sympathy there, certainly. That the one real sentence that sticks out from this whole novel for me was, "Why is black bad? He
Yeah.
doesn't know why black is bad."
Hmm.
Um, so let me ask you this: do you think that Watts the Difference could have been made into a movie?
Oh wow. It would be very it would be a strange movie, right?
It would be a very strange movie,
If you
and
followed the sort of sequence of events the way they're presented in the book, it would just be kind of
yeah, it
it'd
was
be a very dreamlike sort of narrative structure.
like the. Did you see that film, The Tree of Life?
No.
If you've ever seen it, there's a movie. I forgot the guy's name. The guy who directed Badland, Terrence Malick,
Okay.
made a film a couple of years ago, a few years ago actually, called The Tree of Life, and it's basically a businessman. He's thinking back on his past, and all these stories come back to him, and you see the story of his parents and his brother, and I think the brother gets sent off to war and dies, and it's all sort of interwoven, but Terrence Malick wants to put it in the grander context of life in general. This one family's problems, but then you see like sequences of the dinosaurs, and of the universe, of the cosmos, and then there's scenes of like an atom, what I mean? Like everything from the biggest to the smallest. It's all this big tree of life, and so the movie doesn't follow like a traditional narrative. Well, I remember that when that film came out, um, because Sean Penn was in it and Jessica Chastain was in it. So like there are famous people in it. Brad Pitt is the dad. Uh, Movie theaters would have to put out warnings that was like, like the Tree of Life is not a traditional story. This is, don't expect a traditional, this is an art film or whatever, because people were paying money to see the new Brad Pitt movie, and they were getting into Tree of Life,
Okay.
and they were getting very angry. Well, um, I think the movie's kind of cool, but I can see how it would drive some people crazy. And through just sheer accident, I managed to see it in theaters twice. I didn't plan it that way; it just happened that way. And both times, um, there was like a lot of jeering and scoffing toward the end of the movie. So the last scene of it actually gets a lot of like laughs by the end of it. So that's kind of what this this book by Ed Wood kind of reminded me of was the experience of watching The Tree of Life. Was that because in the Tree of Life, there's a scene about a boy drowning in a swimming pool too. That's one of the experiences the narrator remembers. Um, he sees a boy drowning in a swimming pool, and he says to God, "You'll let a boy drown, you'll let anything happen. If you let a boy drown, you'll let anything happen." And then he knows, God can do all these terrible things. So in this book, a scene where Rocky is in his swimming pool might lead to a flashback where a Rocky is almost drowning, and he becomes, and weirdly, that drowning like gives him value for a day or for a few minutes. Like people actually start paying attention, like they're concerned about him for like a minute while he's drowning, and then once he's not drowning anymore, well, he's just back to being another poor black kid that no one cares about.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the day I think that he goes back to his apartment in Watts. And that's when he catches his mom with Preacher Moses. And Preacher Moses gets into a fight with him, and they want to send him to a work camp. As I'm trying to describe this novel, it's impossible because there's so many threads here. It's almost like a short story anthology, kind of melded together into this novel. So that's why I would say in the second book, which we haven't talked about, the second book, Watts After, that one is so much more focused because basically, Rocky gets himself gets into a situation, and the pressure builds up and up and up on Rocky, and you're wondering, how's Rocky going to get out of this? And that that made me think of the. Did you ever hear I think I put in one of the articles what Steven Spielberg says the 3-act structure is all about? Is Act 1, you get your hero up a tree. Act 2, you throw rocks at him. Act 3, you get him back down. And that's kind of what Ed does in the second book. In book 1, there's no semblance of that. It's just it's a melange.
It really
it's a
is.
salad.
We didn't even mention there are characters, sort of ancillary characters that appear for the character Mela Smith. So Rocky at one point meets a 17-year-old girl, and he has a little bit of a fling with her. There seems to be almost no other reason other than it being a sex book, so you want to insert that into the narrative, obviously. But more so, he likes just describing Mela's clothes. Whenever her character comes up, he really thinks she's wearing a yellow mohair sweater and she's wearing yellow capri pants, and he really goes entirely into detailing every little thing about how Mela's dressed. I like that. That's one of the kinds of idiosyncrasies that I find cool about Ed. That's kind of fun.
Well, Mela is is in her own way a very appealing character. Her relationship with Rocky starts in a way that I've never heard a relationship really start before, in that she's basically used as a bait to lead him to a place. Mm-hmm. And you'd think okay, she's trying to lead him to this place where these organization members are going to get him. You think that would be it for him and Mela? Nope. Their relationship keeps going after that. Normally that would be that's a bad first date. But it's fine. Their relationship kind of ends badly. Definitely ends badly. Because, there's another one of Ed's twists. Mela goes back to her place, which is in the middle of Watts, right near where Rocky grew up. And you think is she going to die in the fires? But Eddie has a twist. I don't even want to spoil it, but Eddie has another twist in mind for Mela. Right. And Mela, her story is crazy too. Just another random thread in this book.
That's where we could go. We could go on and on. There's the character Foremost who shows up at the end, who's one of the leaders of the organization. He's a pretty interesting character as well. Of course, where this is all heading from, the most simple narrative arc is that Rocky is, of course, sort of rising in the ranks, and the city will ultimately burn in the end. And then it's suggested, and I find this is the kind of oddball thinking that really only Ed could supply. Rocky gets his gig on a TV show because he's seen jumping from a burning building during the
Yeah.
rioting. So that's his.
That people are
That's,
that somebody's watching the Watts riots and they're like, yes,
he's
that guy,
let's
that
put it.
guy's good.
Let's put him in a Western.
And so the Watts riots ends up making his career for him.
Right.
It's a career move. But I guess, if you think about the roots of, let's say, the Kardashians, the real roots of their fame is the OJ murders. That's why the Kardashians are famous. The Kardashians are famous because their dad was an associate of OJ Simpson, and Robert Kardashian was in the news all the time because of OJ. And then years later, Kim Kardashian is making a sex tape. Well, the sex tape is not what made her famous. The sex tape is only noteworthy because she's the daughter of Robert Kardashian. So people, I guess, can become famous from news events or tragedies. There's the America's Most Wanted guy who became famous because his daughter, I believe, was murdered. So
his son
was murdered. So it doesn't happen very often,
right.
But I guess it happened for Rocky.
Happened to Rocky. So let's super quick. So if you had to say, is this an enjoyable read? Let's kind of try to wrap this up. Is it an enjoyable read? And do you think would you recommend it to others?
Especially, I would. It is a difficult read at first because I was having trouble getting my bearings in the book. The second book is much more straightforward, but yes, I would say this gets right into Eddie's head. This gets right into his personality. This novel has all the topics that Eddie loves to write about. It has all the characteristics of, other than Gothic horror, there's no Gothic horror elements to it, or science fiction, I guess. Although Eddie doesn't really write as much science fiction as people think he does. He doesn't really write that much. But the themes and stuff like that, yeah, definitely. I definitely think people should try and find a copy somewhere of Watts the Difference.
Cool. I agree. I think especially if you're a casual Ed Wood fan, you might perhaps find it a little perplexing. But if you like Ed's idiosyncrasies and you're reasonably familiar with any of his written work, I would say you're gonna absolutely love Watts the Difference. Even though, again, for all of its shortcomings, the lack of character development, the lack of narrative momentum, the jumbled timelines, et cetera, et cetera. Despite all of its shortcomings, it's really just I found it a riveting read. That's why, I took a lot of notes as I was going through it because there was just so much that was worth noting for me as the sort of Ed obsessive. That's why I say a casual Ed fan probably would think it's just out there, but I think it's out there in the true Woodian sense, the best Woodian sense.
I would say before reading this novel, definitely warm up by, if you haven't read any of Ed's stuff, warm up by reading one of the short story compilations that Bob Blackburn put together. Read Blood Splatters Quickly or Angora Fever. Either one of those books will do you fine. Get a sense of how he writes. I wouldn't say this is the place to start, because I think if you start, you'll be drowning yourself in Ed's words. But for the people who know Ed's writing style, I think it's an essential read. I think, yeah.
For sure. So that's Watts the Difference. And yes, we'll come back and we'll let you know what happens to Rocky Alley and Watts after. And hopefully Joe will do this again for some other book reviews as well.
I'd be happy to. I got
some other book reviews. Yeah, this is a lot of fun for me. And So here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast, so this is number 3. We will continue to do Summit podcasts with book reviews. I'll be doing other topics as well and bringing other people on periodically. And hopefully over time, I intend to stick with the podcast format and build out a little library of content that may be of interest to some people. I recognize, of course, we're talking about a fairly marginal.
It's a marginal, but I
it's
think
marginal
to that audience, this is
yes.
gold.
Yes, indeed. So I really do want to thank you, Joe, for joining me here today, and thank you for all your insights. I want to. Is there anything you wanted to say before we wrap?
Buy the book, Dad Made Dirty Movies, The Erotic World of Stephen C. Apostolov. You can get it at Amazon or McFarland.com or Barnes & Noble or wherever books are sold, and it's available in paperback and ebook formats, and it's got tons of pictures, so if you can't read, that's great. We got you covered. So yeah, that's it.
Cool. And yeah, highly recommend, obviously, that you guys go out and get that book. I'll link to information on the book in the description box to the video, and I'll also link to the Dead Rights blog, where Ed Wood Wednesdays has lived since 2013. So so look for that. Expect us back at some point in the near future. And thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.
Right.
Bye.